Welcome to Our Appalachia. My name is Phil Conn. I'm your host for this series, and as you know, we discuss various aspects of the heritage and the culture of Appalachian Kentucky, and indeed all of the Appalachian South. Today we have a topic that touches all of us, mail delivery. We're going to talk about early post offices in eastern Kentucky, and in general, we're going to talk about the way folks submitted mail to the U.S. Postal Service and received it years ago right up to recent times. We have as a guest Ersil Pitts Ward, who is from Muses Mill, Kentucky. And for those of you who don't know where Muses Mill is, it's right out beyond Plummer's Landing, isn't it, Mr. Ward?
That's right.
It's in Fleming County, not too far from us. And Mr. Ward was a public school teacher for many years. In fact, he received both baccalaureate degrees and master's degree from Morehead State University, has studied since at the University of Kentucky, and has a very interesting career, including some travel over in Europe and teaching in some special programs there. But Mr. Ward has become very interested in early mail delivery in eastern Kentucky, and I'm going to ask you, Mr. Ward, exactly how did you come to be interested in early post offices in eastern Kentucky?
Well, Phil, some youngsters had an assignment in social studies to find out something about their communities. Mm-hmm. And they came to me for help. And I began on a local basis, giving them what I knew, but their questions went deeper beyond what I had knowledge of, so I began to dig in for them and on behalf of them and myself to finding out when, where communities and post offices had their beginning and when they were discontinued, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Well, as a result, you're making a tremendous contribution to the database, the information we have about early mail delivery in this part of the country. And I'm glad that you're going to talk with us today about the post offices and the postal system in this area.
Thank you.
Tell me, when did mail delivery, and I'm talking now about the U.S. Postal Service, first appear in eastern Kentucky? I guess it was one of the first things the national government did in this area.
Well, the first date I found for eastern Kentucky was 1792 at Tuckahoe, now later Limestone, later Maysville.
Right.
And from that, mail delivery moved inland to Flemingsburg, Morehead, etc.
But what is now Maysville was one of the major points of entry.
It was a point of entry from the Ohio River.
So a post office was established there very shortly after the Revolutionary War?
1792.
I see. But so far as the development of post offices in Rowan County, in Fleming County, in Carter County, that was sometime later?
In the early 1800s, about 1801. When was the first date I found?
When was the first post office in Rowan County, for example?
Well, the very first post office in Rowan County was Morehead. That is when Morehead became a county. The triplet post office that had formerly been in Fleming County was moved to Morehead in 1856. Shortly after Rowan County was formed.
But now this was after Rowan became a county?
That's after Rowan became a county, yes.
When was the post office established in Farmers?
In 1849 about.
Okay, so it was earlier than Morehead.
Yes, yes, it was in Fleming County too.
That was before the division of this county?
Before the division of this county, yes.
Okay,
Triplet and Farmers were both listed in Fleming County.
So shortly before the Civil War, about the time of the Civil War, we first find post offices appearing in Rowan County and I guess in other mountainous counties of eastern Kentucky.
That's right, that's right.
When post offices were first established, what was the nature of the service? In other words, how was mail brought in and how was it distributed?
Well, it was brought in primarily by horseback, wagon. In some cases, pack over a man's shoulder. He would carry his mail in, his saddlebag on his back, where the road was some cases too muddy for a horse to get through.
And this was before you even had railroads in eastern Kentucky.
Right. So post offices grew, though, little by little as communities grew and people branched out from where they lived to someplace else. And when the population was sufficiently large, they applied or petitioned for a post office. And if there was sufficient interest and sufficient volume, a post office was established.
So from the time of the Civil War until, say, the turn of the century, you had post offices going from none to how many? How many post offices were there, say, at the turn of the century in a county like Rowan or Fleming?
Well, Rowan County had a maximum of 43 post offices altogether. Fleming had a maximum of 58. Lewis had a maximum of 90.
I'll be.
And Mason had a maximum of 34.
So to a great extent, this not only had to do with the population, but it had to do with the surface area. The idea, I guess, was to have a post office near every person.
As near as you could.
Because you had a great limitation in transportational facilities or roadways at that point in time.
That's correct.
Okay. So what was the nature of the service in a little post office in a hamlet? Obviously, they were receiving mail that was going out from the individual citizens, and they were receiving mail to be delivered. What other things happened, though?
Oh, in the hamlet, usually in a store, they had groceries, they had produce, they had dry goods, they had notions, they had hardware. Anything that a farmer or a patron needed, he usually could get from the store where the post office was situated.
So at the turn of the century, post offices were located in feed mills and grocery stores?
Anywhere they could find a roof.
But there's no such thing as a post office building?
Not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge.
These developed much later, and I guess only in larger towns.
Early 30s. They began to appear in towns like Morehead, or rather Flemingsburg. I'll take that for an example.
How were postmasters or postmistresses selected, say, at the turn of the century?
Well, somebody had to recommend them. They were appointed by the president.
You mean the President of the United States?
After the Civil War, the President of the United States appointed postmasters and postmistresses. Before that, I'm not sure how they were recommended to the Postal Department.
But now you're telling me that a little hamlet, say like Triplet, Kentucky, or Farmers, Kentucky, the postmaster there was a direct U.S. presidential appointee after the Civil War.
Early in, or after the 1890s, they were appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate.
This is nationwide?
Nationwide then.
So it was a big-time appointment at that point. Was there some political influence?
Apparently there was.
In other words, you had a turnover with elections?
Often. There was, in some cases, a postmaster wouldn't stay in office less than a month.
This, of course, isn't a matter of record. This is something you've gotten from oral history.
No, a matter of record. In some cases, two different postmasters would be appointed in the same calendar month.
I see. But there's nothing in the record that says that postmaster jobs go with political elections.
No record of that. Just the fact that there was a turnover.
You were telling me an interesting story about a post office in Fleming County that had to do with the changeover in an election.
Yes.
Mind telling me about that?
Yes, back in 1914, a gentleman in Fleming County had been promised postmastership if President Wilson was elected. And following the election, when the word was received back in Fleming County that President Wilson had been elected, this gentleman came down to the post office and just started literally moving things out. The postmaster in charge, who had taken an oath to defend the post office and the mails, began swinging at him, and they really had a bloody knockout. It ended up that the new postmaster-to-be didn't get to move the post office out that day. And then shortly thereafter, the post office was discontinued.
So a lot of people could assume there was a little bit of political dealing at some level.
It would look like it at that rate.
You're suggesting, though, that a new postmaster, at least a guy who aspired to be, was moving materials out, I guess taking it to his store.
Taking it to his store.
Because the post office would actually change locations. Now, I've heard that having a post office in your store was viewed as a key to having business.
Oh, of course. Yes,
So as post offices went, so went buyers for other products.
Because people daily came to your store if it had the post office in it. They didn't necessarily go daily to somebody else's business. or weekly whenever the mail came in.
There was real scrap then to be an official post office.
That's right.
How were post offices named? You said that citizens could petition the government, I guess the national government, to get a post office located in a hamlet. But was there a particular way in which post offices were named?
Well, I have one example I think is good. In Lewis County, there is a post office known as Trotter.
Mm-hmm.
The postmaster's wife's maiden name was Trotter, so he suggested that the post office be named Trotter, and that name stayed until it was discontinued and the mail went to Strickland. Another interesting illustration of that, on Straight Fork in Lewis County, there was a post office named Awe, A-W-E. Awe is an acronym for Anthony Wayne Everman, who was the first postmaster.
So what you're telling me is a lot of names for post offices had to do with family names or some family association.
That's correct.
Of the postmaster.
That's correct.
So in a lot of cases, they were literally naming communities in an official way because of the need to have a name for a post office rather than taking some traditional name and putting it on a post office.
That's correct. And an illustration of that is Dalesburg in Fleming County. When Dalesburg was being established, the postal people wanted the new postmaster to suggest a name, and he had a good neighbor that lived across the street by the name of Dale, across the road rather, by the name of Dale. He says, let's call it Dalesburg, and so they did. Now, at that time, there was nothing on the map to show a community of Dalesburg. But later, the map shows the community of Dalesburg. It's just an illustration of that.
Even if there were place names, there was no reason to make it official until you had a post office, I guess.
Generally speaking, that's right.
So at that point, if you wanted a town named after you, if you wanted to live on in the minds of men, I guess it was more important to be a postmaster.
Find yourself a place where you could become a postmaster. In some instances, post office names were changed when postmasters were changed to pick up the new postmaster's name.
I asked a while ago if there was such a thing as a postmistress early on. Was a postmaster position viewed as a predominantly male occupation, say the time of the Civil War, or did women have equal opportunity like they did in teaching school?
After the Civil War, ladies' names began to show up more frequently. And as the time moved on, ladies more and more and more were appointed as in charge of post offices.
But that was slower happening than it was, say, in school teaching, where women
yes,
tended
definitely.
to dominate
Definitely.
at that time. How did mail get from major distribution points like Maysville to county seats or other areas where it was then fanned out into rural post offices?
Oh, yes. From Maysville, it could have come by stagecoach because there was a stagecoach line to Flemingsburg. And from there to Triplet in what's now Round County, or Farmers, what's now in Round County, it went by horse or wagon from post office to post office, and as they went by from one office to the other, they delivered, picked up mail, and carried it on. And along the way, if somebody lived on the way, they would deliver mail and packages that were addressed to them.
I see. Now, these were not government employees.
Oh, no, they were contract carriers.
Okay.
They were contract
now,
carriers.
you're describing what I guess is called a star route.
That's right.
This was going from one point for distribution of mail to other points further down the system.
Right.
So a star route is from one major post office to a smaller post office.
Or on to 2 or 3 maybe in the route.
And this was done by contract carriers. Now, what do you mean by contract carrier? Would a fellow literally negotiate with Uncle Sam?
He would submit a bid that he would carry the mail from point to point, or whatever the route that was laid out, for a given amount of money. And if the both of us submitted a bid, you had the low bid, you got the mail carrier's job.
So since the guy was actually a private businessman, if he wanted to deliver or pick up milk to take to market,
oh, definitely,
or carry packages on his own,
right.
In fact, he could, in a way, compete with the U.S. mail if he wanted.
Oh, yes.
It was almost like today, the U.S. mail and the UPS combined.
Right.
You could decide whether it was U.S. mail or personal delivery without any problem.
An illustration of that, here in Round County, there was a post office at Cranston. A gentleman had the contract for carrying the mail from Cranston across up Holly, across the hill to the railroad at what is called Easton then, back over the mountain, up North Fork to Waltz, across the hill to head of Clear Fork, and down Clear Fork to a place called New Way, and then on to Cranston. That was his circle, that was his route for the day. Now that contract carrier got $40 a month. But on the way, he could pick up cream, take it to the cream station on the railroad at Easton. He could bring back bread or other perishable supplies from the railroad to the stores along the route. And
so he was just an all-purpose delivery
that
man.
was extra pay for him. He got paid individually for the services he served, or the services he provided for his patrons.
But now you're introducing here a notion of home delivery in conjunction with these star routes, but that wasn't expected or maybe not even obligatory.
No.
This is just a courtesy. If you were passing by a house,
if you were passing by a house, you could give him his mail.
Going from one post office to the other. Okay, but at the turn of the century, there was no such thing as rural free delivery in this area, was there?
Well, not very much. In 1907, the first rural free delivery route out of Wallingford was 17.5 miles long. In 1918, Route 2 out of Wallingford was established to take the place of post offices that had been discontinued, and folks had to go, well, my folks, for instance, had to go to Goddard across a mountain, or to Muses Mills across a mountain from where we lived then. And after the rural mail routes were established, all we had to do was go up the top of a hill and get our mail in a mailbox.
Okay, but when you say up the top of the hill, even then and even now, you couldn't have mail delivered right to your home?
No, by no means, because...
What is the law? In other words, how close does the Postal Service have to bring a letter to your home?
If you live, now this is the latest information I had, if you live within a mile of an established postal route, they say that is your job to go get your mail, unless you can get you some neighbors that live in the community or off the road. And if you can get about 3 or 4 to a mile, the postal department decides it's feasible, then they will extend a route into that.
Well, with your mail being picked up that far from home, yet out of the post office, was there any concern for security?
Well, all of our mailboxes had locks on them. They were all keyed. The post office and the mail carrier had a master key, and each of us had a key that would only work on the lock on our mailbox.
I'll be. So there was more concern really with securing mail then than now.
Definitely.
But a lot of folks continued, I guess, either out of preference or no choice, to come to the post office to receive mail.
Yes, that's even true today.
And there are a couple of ways you could do that. I guess you could rent a box. Did you have to pay rental even in the early part of this century?
The small post offices didn't have locked boxes as with combinations on them as the Morehead State does, or Flemingsburg.
Just a pigeonhole.
A pigeonhole. And usually, my experience was you had to ask for the mail, and the person in charge would go into the little cubicle back in the corner of the store and get your mail and hand it out to you.
So it was really kind of glorified general delivery.
Right.
They put it in your pigeonhole, but it was actually handed to you upon request.
Right.
How did you address mail then? You were just after the name of a person and the post office.
Post office. No other designation. I found in some of the records where post offices had been established and mail had started to leave, but the state had not been designated on the post office. So I found later notations that the mail could not be delivered until they got an established state in which that post office was located. Early days, the post offices were listed according to when they were established. It might be the Indiana Territory, the Oklahoma Territory, the Arkansas Territory, or let's say Ashland, Kentucky.
With designations, though, that general, like a name and a post office name, were there problems with confusion in mail being sent to the wrong place?
Oh, often. One illustration I think I pointed out to you was a case of Sanford, S-A-N-F-O-R-D, in Rockcastle County, and S-A-N-D-F-O-R-D in Fleming County. Now the mail was continually being confused with the Rockcastle County address. So in 1902, the Postal Department decided to change the name of Sanford in Fleming County to Goddard to keep the confusion, the missent mail, to Rockcastle County.
So sometimes the name of the post office, for practical reasons, was different from the name of the hamlet, or the traditional name of the hamlet.
That's right. In case of Goddard, the hamlet was Hamburg. The cemetery and church were Goddard's Chapel, and the post office was Sanford. But after the old people passed away, Sanford was forgotten, Hamburg was forgotten, and then the only thing we knew in my age was Goddard.
So the name of a post office did have some staying power.
Right.
It's real funny now when you do research on population distribution, or you try to locate folks as to urban and rural. Increasingly it's difficult because people give an address, of course, as a mailing address. If they give an address Morehead, Kentucky, they might not live in the city limits, probably don't.
That's right.
They might live 10, 15, 20 miles away, way out in the country. So at that time you had a different type of problem, a problem that had to do with the confusion of similar names. Now you can't really locate where a person lives by virtue of their mailing address.
Oh, very definitely not. You get lost finding somebody that lives in Morehead when he lives actually over in the head of Rock Fork or Island Fork or Clear Fork or someplace like that. Now, one illustration of this mail getting lost, when Upper Blue Licks was established in early part of the 1800s, John Finley, the gentleman who told Daniel Boone about this country, was the postmaster there, the first postmaster. Well, when that post office was discontinued, John Finley's mail ended up at Fleming Courthouse. And in an 1836 issue of the Flemingsburg Whig, there was a list of patrons who had mail in Flemingsburg post office that had not been called for. And they had a notice that within 3 months, if that mail wasn't picked up, it would be sent to the dead letter office. Now, I don't know where the dead letter office was. So that was an illustration of what happened.
At that time, though, the flow of mail was so limited and relationships were so personal that they would actually list undelivered or unclaimed mail in a newspaper.
Right.
That was a very personable approach.
Yes. And week after week, the Flemingsburg paper carried the list of people whose mail hadn't been
should pick
picked
up their mail.
Yes.
I'll be. What were the fees, let's say, at the turn of the century for, say, a typical letter or a package?
The first postage that I remember was 1 cent for a card, 2 cents for a first class letter. Now, it's going what?
It's
2,000%?
It's growing fast, that's for sure.
Yes.
And your age is?
I'm 73.
Okay, so you start a few years back and have seen the Postal Service change drastically in that period of time. Have there ever been any troubles with post offices being robbed or raided, or people trying to intercept the mail in this country?
Yes, yes. Now, Plummer's Landing was robbed, that is when I say robbed, burglarized, probably is a better word, in the last 20 years.
And that's one of the outstanding federal offenses, I guess, early on, because the U.S. mail was federal.
So they got in during the night, broke the safe open, and took things they needed. That was the only one that I can remember locally that was broken into or burglarized, I think. I don't think I know of any that has been robbed at gunpoint.
When did post offices in rural areas start being discontinued? When did the real move to consolidate post offices begin?
After the turn of the century, they began to drop off noticeably. They've fallen off even now. So, for instance, there's only 7 post offices now in Fleming County from 58, and I think you told me we're down to less than 10 in Rowan County?
Yes,
so,
considerably less.
And
now even many post offices don't have home delivery originating from that post office.
No. Now in Fleming County, for instance, Plummer's Landing doesn't have rural delivery out. Muses Mills doesn't have rural delivery out. Elizaville doesn't have that. Ewing, Flemingsburg, Hillsborough, and Wallingford are the only ones that I know now that have rural delivery out of the office.
I've heard it explained that one reason, say 100 years ago, you needed a lot of post offices is not only that transportation was poor around the county, but that a postmaster, beyond selling stamps, would actually help individuals package the mail, put addresses on the mail, that a lot of people couldn't read and write, and they viewed it as a community service. Have you found any evidence of that?
And even read the mail for persons who had received mail that came for it and couldn't read it. I've observed that.
Were there requirements that postmasters themselves could read and write, or do you know?
Well, I have not found that in the records, but I found evidence that some postmasters who had been nominated couldn't qualify for one reason or another. Possibly they couldn't get somebody to go to their bond, excuse me, or they couldn't sort the mail efficiently.
Do you feel that with the discontinuation of a lot of post offices that a sense of community pride and identity has diminished, or are other things picking it up?
Very definitely, because
the whole notion of community used to revolve around a school, a church,
and a school and a church. Right. Now, schools are consolidated, post offices are consolidated, churches are even being consolidated somewhat, and every community that once had a church now doesn't, in our area at least.
Well, I guess, Mr. Ward, this is being done in the name of modernization and efficiency. Is that indeed happening? Is Postal Service getting better as we centralize it?
I'll ask you a question.
Okay.
If I mail a letter out of Muses Mills to my address at Wallingford, 3/4 of a mile up the road, it'll probably go to Cincinnati and get postmarked and come back to me tomorrow or Monday. Some cases 3 days later, in one case recently, 3 days later, a letter returned to Wallingford after having gone to Cincinnati. I'll just let you answer. Was that more efficient or less?
Well, I tell you, I'm not going to answer that question. We'll leave our television audience with that question. That's a good one to muse on while we're talking about Muses Mill. And of course, early days, mail delivery was very slow, but a lot of people suggest that it's getting slow all over again. Anyway, you've given us a lot of valuable information. To me, this is very fascinating because the mail is very important to our lives. And you've given us some notion of how it was conducted after the Civil War and around the turn of the century. So thank you very much, Mr. Ward, for joining us. And I encourage you to join us again as we take up another interesting aspect of the history and culture of Appalachia.
Thank you.